Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. Dr. Evan Trent sat in his modest laboratory, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the soft glow of computer screens. His work had always been his solace, an escape from the mundane world outside. At 36, Evan had already given up on most of the conventional dreams of companionship and love. His fascination with genetics, with the mysteries hidden in the very essence of life, had taken priority. It was a typical evening. He adjusted his glasses and scribbled a few notes on his latest research, the flickering lights of his equipment illuminating his tired face. Outside, the suburban neighborhood of his small town slumbered beneath a dark, starless sky. The silence was heavy, comforting, until it was suddenly shattered. A deafening boom rocked the house. Evan leaped from his chair, heart pounding, as the windows rattled and the walls shook. For a moment, he thought it was an earthquake, but the sound was too localized. He rushed to the nearest window, his breath quickening as he peered out into the backyard. Through the darkness and settling smoke, something glinted, a sleek, metallic object partially embedded in the earth. Evan's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. There, in the center of the wreckage, lay a craft unlike anything he had ever imagined. A shimmering, silver vessel, small but undoubtedly not of this world. He threw open the door and ran into the cool night air, his feet skidding to a halt at the edge of the crater. The vessel hissed, releasing bursts of steam and light. His pulse raced as his scientific curiosity battled with primal fear. Before he could make sense of the moment, a panel on the side of the craft slid open. Evan's heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged. A silhouette, feminine in shape but clearly alien. The being stepped forward, her skin a luminous shade of emerald green, her eyes large and almond-shaped, glowing softly in the dim light. She was tall, slender, and moved with a grace that defied human limitations. Evan stood frozen, staring. For a moment, the world around him seemed to fall silent. His brain reeled, struggling to reconcile the impossible with reality. Then she smiled. "Hello there," she said, her voice melodic, almost teasing. "I hope I haven't caused too much trouble with my landing." Evan blinked, his mouth dry. You're an alien." The creature tilted her head, her expression both amused and curious. "Yes, I suppose that's what you would call me. My name is Alira." He couldn't respond. His mind swam with 100 questions, but none of them formed coherent thoughts. Alira stepped closer, her movements fluid, her eyes scanning him with what he could only describe as genuine interest. "You are? Human?" she asked, almost as though confirming something obvious. "Yes," Evan finally managed to croak, his throat tight. "Evan, I'm Evan Trent." "Alira," she repeated, as though savoring the sound of his name. "I am from the star system you would know as Gliese 581. My mission was one of observation, but I seem to have gotten rather off course." Her tone was light, almost playful. Evan ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process the sight in front of him. "Observation? Of what?" Alira's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Your species, of course. Humanity is fascinating to us. You have developed in ways unique. Emotion, reproduction, pleasure, all tied together in a way that most other species do not." Evan's head spun. He had read theories about extraterrestrial life, about the possibility of other civilizations out there, but nothing prepared him for the reality of standing face to face with one of them. Before he could ask more, Alira's gaze shifted to her surroundings. "This place, it is your home?" she asked, gesturing to the small, unremarkable house behind him. "Yeah," Evan replied, still numb from shock. "It's nothing special." "I find it quaint," she said, stepping closer to him. "May I stay for a while?" Evan's brain, still stuck in disbelief, struggled to catch up with her words. "Stay? Here? With me?" Alira nodded, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Yes, I cannot return to my ship for now. It is damaged. I would very much like to observe human behavior more closely." "Observe?" Evan blinked. "You mean, like, live with me?" A soft laugh escaped her lips. "If that is not too much trouble, I am quite adaptable, and I can blend in if needed." He didn't know what to say. A million objections rose in his mind, but none seemed relevant when faced with the reality of the alien in front of him. His scientific side kicked in. This was the discovery of a lifetime, and he couldn't just turn her away. Not without learning more. Not without understanding. "Okay," he said, surprising even himself. "You can stay, but you'll need a cover story. We can't just have an alien walking around in plain sight." Alira smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "That can be arranged." With a small wave of her hand, her appearance began to shift. Her green skin faded into a more human tone, her otherworldly features smoothing into something more familiar. In moments, she looked almost entirely human, save for the still ethereal glow in her eyes. "How's this?" she asked, spinning playfully in front of him. Evan gaped. That'll do." "Wonderful," she beamed, clasping her hands together. "Then, Dr. Evan Trent, shall we begin? I have so much to learn about your kind." Evan sighed, rubbing his temples as the weight of the situation began to settle in. His life, which had once been a quiet cycle of research and solitude, had just been irreversibly upended. As they stepped inside, he glanced back at the crater in his yard, the spacecraft still embedded in the Earth. Nothing would ever be the same again. Evan was used to living alone. His days were filled with the familiar sounds of his small suburban home, the quiet whir of machines, the occasional hum of a microwave, the clacking of his fingers on a keyboard. But now, everything had changed. Alira had brought with her a new rhythm. A strange, unsettling, but undeniably exciting one. From the moment she moved in, Alira's curiosity seemed boundless. Nothing escaped her alien gaze, not the mundane routines of human life, nor the intricacies of emotion she observed in Evan. For her, every small gesture, every subtle movement, every unspoken emotion was a puzzle to be solved. "Why do humans eat 3 times a day?" she asked one morning, leaning over the kitchen counter with wide, inquisitive eyes. "Is it a biological necessity, or is it some sort of social ritual?" Evan, in the middle of making breakfast, paused mid-scramble. He looked at her, trying to decide how to explain something so simple, so human. "It's a bit of both, I guess," he said, feeling the weight of her stare. "We eat to stay alive, but meals are also a time for people to come together, to talk." Alira nodded, her gaze never leaving him, as if she were studying every muscle movement in his face. "Interesting. Food is sustenance and connection. My people consume nutrients more efficiently, but without the emotional exchange." "Emotional exchange?" Evan smirked, unable to hide his amusement. "You make it sound so clinical." "To me, it is clinical," Alira said simply, tilting her head in that curious alien way that made Evan's heart skip a beat. "Your species thrives on emotions, fear, love, desire. You feel everything so intensely. I want to understand it." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, one that made Evan suddenly aware of the space between them, the quiet intimacy of standing together in his small kitchen. He turned back to the stove, hiding the flush creeping up his neck. Over the next few days, Alira's questions became more direct, more intimate. She studied him relentlessly, often asking things he had no idea how to answer. "Why do you sleep alone?" she asked one evening, standing at the door of his bedroom as he prepared to settle in for the night. Her voice was soft, as if she genuinely didn't understand the question. Evan blinked at her, thrown off by the unexpected nature of her inquiry. Well, because I don't have anyone else to sleep with." Alira stepped closer, her glowing eyes narrowing in contemplation. "In your culture, does sharing a bed signify a bond? Physical or emotional?" Evan shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether this conversation was veering into territory he wasn't prepared for. "Sometimes, yes, it can mean that, but not always. Some people just sleep alone, and some people don't." She seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if every sentence held some deeper truth she had yet to uncover. "In my species, physical closeness is rarely a necessity. Our bonds are formed mentally through shared consciousness, but I have noticed that humans value touch, hugging, kissing, even sleeping side by side. It seems so vital." Evan met her gaze, his heart racing slightly. There was something both innocent and deeply intense about the way she spoke, as if human intimacy was not just an interest, but a puzzle she needed to solve. The longer she stayed with him, the more he felt her pulling at the strings of his own guarded emotions. She was relentless, and he couldn't deny that her presence was beginning to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her questions about relationships, about love, and desire grew more frequent. She seemed particularly fixated on the idea of human mating, often bringing it up at the most unexpected times. "Do you love anyone, Evan?" she asked one night as they sat on the couch, watching a movie. The question came out of nowhere, catching him off guard. He glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Love? I mean, no, not right now." Alira nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Is love necessary for reproduction in your species?" The question was so clinical, so detached, and yet, in the softness of her voice, Evan sensed something more. A hunger to understand, a curiosity that went beyond mere observation. It was as if Alira wanted to feel what he felt, to understand the full spectrum of human experience, and perhaps to be a part of it. Evan cleared his throat, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "No, people don't always have to be in love to reproduce, but many do," Alira pressed, her eyes locked on his. "I've read that love can enhance the connection between two people, make the act of reproduction more meaningful. Is that true?" Evan shifted, suddenly aware of the tension between them. The way her curiosity seemed to draw him in, making him question things he had long kept buried. For some people, yes, love makes things different, more intense. Alira leaned closer, her voice a whisper. I want to understand what that feels like. His breath caught in his throat as her words hung in the air between them. This wasn't just an academic curiosity anymore. There was something deeper happening. Something Evan wasn't sure he was ready for. But the pull was undeniable. And in that moment, as they sat together in the dim light of his living room, Evan knew one thing for certain: his life was no longer his own. Not entirely. Alira had come from beyond the stars, but her curiosity, her desire to understand the human heart, had changed everything. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. It had been weeks since Alira crash-landed in Evan's life, and the boundaries between them had grown impossibly thin. What had started as an observation of human behavior had turned into something more, something neither of them had anticipated, or perhaps even fully understood. Evan tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but Alira's presence made that impossible. Her constant curiosity about human intimacy had become a tension that weighed heavily on both of them. It was no longer just innocent questions. There was something deeper between them now. Something unspoken that neither dared to fully address. That night, the storm outside raged against the windows. The sky was a constant flicker of lightning, the thunder shaking the very walls of the house. Alira stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the violent light. Evan watched her from the couch, his mind swirling with the chaos of emotions he had tried so hard to keep under control. "Do storms frighten you?" Alira asked, her voice soft and melodic. She turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. Evan shook his head. "No, not really. I actually kind of like them. They make the world feel alive." Alira tilted her head, stepping away from the window. "In my world, we do not experience such raw natural forces. The environment is controlled, balanced. I find your planet's unpredictability fascinating." She crossed the room slowly, her gaze never leaving his. Something about the way she moved, the way the shadows played across her otherworldly features, sent a shiver down Evan's spine. The storm outside seemed to mirror the growing intensity between them, a force of nature that couldn't be ignored. "Alira," he started, his voice thick with uncertainty, but she was already in front of him, her eyes searching his face for answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. "Evan," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, "you've been avoiding me." "I haven't been avoiding you." He lied, though they both knew it wasn't true. He had been avoiding the feelings that had been building between them, the ones he was afraid to confront. "You have," she said softly, her gaze intense. "Ever since we began talking about human intimacy, you've pulled away. I don't understand why." Evan swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. How could he explain that the very thing she was trying to understand was the thing that terrified him the most? That despite all her alien strangeness, he was beginning to feel something real for her. Something he couldn't easily ignore or rationalize away. I'm not good at this, Alira," he admitted, his voice barely audible. This thing between us. It's not just scientific for me anymore." Alira's eyes softened, and she knelt in front of him, her hand resting lightly on his knee. "It's not just scientific for me either, Evan." Her words sent a jolt through him, a mixture of relief and fear crashing over him. This was it. The line they had both danced around for so long was finally about to be crossed. "I want to understand," she continued, her voice filled with an almost childlike wonder. "Not just intellectually. I want to feel it, the connection, the closeness that humans share, but I don't know how." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. His pulse was loud in his ears, drowning out the storm outside. He leaned forward, his forehead almost touching hers, their breaths mingling in the space between them. "You don't have to know," he whispered. You just have to let it happen." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The only sound was the faint hum of the storm outside and the rapid beating of his heart. And then slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force, their lips met. It was soft at first, tentative, like the first drops of rain before a storm breaks. But the moment their skin touched, everything changed. Alira's breath caught in her throat, and she pulled him closer, her fingers digging into his shirt as if trying to anchor herself to something real, something human. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressed together in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable. Evan's hands slid down her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her clothes. He could feel her trembling against him, not with fear but with something else, something new, something neither of them had words for. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, Alira's eyes were wide, her lips parted in surprise. "That," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That was real," Evan finished for her, his own voice just as unsteady. That was real. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. They both knew it. Evan reached for her again, pulling her into his arms as the storm outside continued to rage. But the storm inside was louder now, a whirlwind of emotions that neither of them could ignore. In that moment, beneath the flickering light of the storm and the weight of the choices they had made, Evan realized that whatever this was, whatever had sparked between them, it was more than just curiosity, more than just science. It was human, and it was alien, and it was everything they had been afraid to feel. Alira stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling as she stared down at the small plastic device in her palm. The two faint lines that appeared on its surface seemed impossibly bright, as if they were mocking the very laws of nature. She was pregnant. Her heart pounded in her chest, a sensation she had only begun to understand in her time with Evan. But this was different. This wasn't a mere curiosity about human life or emotions. This was life itself, growing inside her, something neither she nor Evan had ever imagined could happen. For a long moment she couldn't move. Her mind raced, running through all the possibilities, all the biological improbabilities. Her species wasn't supposed to be compatible with humans, or so she had believed. Their forms were so different, their genetic makeup so foreign. And yet, here she was, holding undeniable proof that something had taken root inside her. Life, created from their union. A union that was never supposed to be anything more than an experiment. Alira? Evan's voice from outside the bathroom broke through the haze of her thoughts. He was waiting for her, oblivious to the reality she was now forced to confront. She hadn't told him yet. She hadn't even told him she suspected. How could she, when she barely understood it herself? Alira? He called again, his voice tinged with concern. She could hear his footsteps approaching the door. You've been in there a while. Are you okay? She swallowed hard, her throat tight. This wasn't something she could hide from him. Not anymore. I need to show you something, she said, her voice unsteady. The door creaked open, and Evan's worried face appeared in the doorway. He glanced at her, then at the object in her hand, his brow furrowed. What's that? Alira handed him the pregnancy test, her fingers brushing his as she did. He looked down, confusion etched into his features at first, and then, slowly, his eyes widened. Is this? His voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Alira nodded, her throat tightening with emotions she didn't fully understand. I'm pregnant, Evan? The words hung in the air, suspended between them like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. She watched his face, waiting for a reaction, any reaction, that would help her make sense of this impossible situation. Evan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took a step back, his hands falling to his sides as if the weight of what she had just said was too much for him to carry. But how? How is this even possible? I don't know, Alira whispered. It shouldn't be possible. Our species we're not compatible, at least not in the way humans are with each other. But somehow, she placed a hand on her abdomen, her voice faltering. Somehow, it happened. Evan ran a hand through his hair, his face pale with shock. This doesn't make any sense. It defies everything we know about biology. I've been trying to understand it, Alira continued, her voice tight with tension. But there's no explanation in either of our sciences. I've never seen this happen between species as different as ours. It's unprecedented. Evan collapsed onto the edge of the bed, his face in his hands. God, Alira, this changes everything. A child? Our child? The weight of his words pressed down on her, and for the first time, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly or an experiment gone wrong. It was something real. Something that connected them in a way that went beyond curiosity, beyond observation. It was life. A new life that would tie her to this planet and to Evan in a way that was as irreversible as it was terrifying. She sat down beside him, her hand trembling as it reached for his. I didn't plan for this, Evan. Neither of us did. But it's happening, and I don't know what it means. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the storm of emotions swirling between them. Alira could feel the uncertainty in Evan's grip, the way his fingers tightened and loosened, as if struggling to find some solid ground in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. Finally, Evan looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of wonder and fear. What do we do now? Alira's heart raced. She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But there was one thing she did know. We face it together. We figure it out. This is new for both of us, but we'll find a way. Evan let out a shaky breath, nodding. Yeah, together. They sat there in the quiet, holding on to each other as the reality of their situation settled in. The air around them seemed charged with something new, something neither of them had prepared for. a future they hadn't imagined, but one they would have to navigate together. As Alira rested her hand on her abdomen, feeling the faint pulse of life within her, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of world their child would be born into. A child that was part human, part alien. A child that defied the very laws of existence. The unknown stretched out before them, vast and terrifying. But for the first time, Alira wasn't afraid. She was ready. The days that followed the discovery of Alira's pregnancy were a blur of confusion, fear, and whispered conversations in the quiet of the night. Despite their shared decision to face the unknown together, both Evan and Alira were haunted by the weight of what this meant for their lives. And as her body slowly adjusted to this new life growing inside her, Alira could feel the growing distance from the world she had once known. Evan sat beside her one evening, their small kitchen filled with the soft glow of candlelight. Outside, the evening was still, a sharp contrast to the storm that had raged just weeks before. The air between them was heavy, though, charged with questions neither of them had dared to ask yet. Alira could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look up. She absently traced her fingers over her abdomen, still not showing but holding a secret that was growing larger each day. It was strange to feel this close to something so completely unfamiliar. For so long, her life had been a clinical, detached study of other worlds. Now, she was connected to one in a way she had never imagined possible. "Have you thought about what's next?" Evan's voice broke the silence, and she could hear the tension in it, the unspoken fears, the doubts that lingered just beneath the surface. Alira sighed, her fingers pausing on her stomach. "Every moment," she admitted softly, "but I don't have an answer." Evan leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, his eyes searching her face for something she couldn't give. "Your people, won't they come looking for you? I mean, this pregnancy, it's impossible. Won't they want to intervene?" Alira's chest tightened at his words. She had tried not to think about that, about what would happen if her people found out. Her mission was supposed to be simple: observe, report, and leave. There was no room for emotional entanglements, for personal connections. Certainly no room for the creation of life with another species. "They would consider it a contamination," she said, her voice low. "A failure of my mission. If they knew, they would take me back. And I would lose everything." Evan's face paled, the weight of her words sinking in. "Lose everything?" he echoed. "What do you mean?" "I would be exiled," Alira explained, her voice shaking. "Cut off from my home, my people. I would never be able to return. For them, emotional attachment to another species is a weakness, a flaw in our objectivity. They wouldn't allow me to stay." Evan stared at her, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the enormity of what she was saying. "You're talking about leaving forever? You're saying if they find out, we'll never?" She nodded, the ache in her chest almost unbearable. "Yes, they would take me back, Evan, and they would erase what I've become here. This child, this love between us, it would be undone." The silence that followed was suffocating, a crushing weight that neither of them could shake. Evan's hands clenched into fists, his face tight with frustration. "But you love me, don't you?" he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Tell me that's real. Tell me it's more than just some scientific curiosity." Alira's heart ached at the desperation in his voice. She reached out, her hand gently brushing his, trying to offer him the reassurance she knew he needed. "I love you," she said softly. "I didn't know it could feel like this, not until I met you, but I do, it's real." Evan's breath hitched, and he grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then don't leave. Stay here with me. We can figure this out. We can hide if we have to. I don't care what your people think. I can't lose you, Alira. Not now. Not after everything." Tears welled in her eyes, something she had rarely experienced before coming to Earth. Her species didn't cry. They didn't express emotion in such raw, physical ways. But being with Evan had changed her, had made her feel things she never thought possible. And the thought of losing him, of losing this life they had built together, was unbearable. "I don't want to leave you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But if they find out?" "They won't," Evan interrupted, his voice firm, determined. "We'll make sure of it. We'll hide you. We'll keep this quiet. But you can't go. Not now. Not ever." Alira looked into his eyes, seeing the raw emotion in them. The fear, the love, the hope. She had never felt such a connection to another being before, and the thought of walking away from it tore at her soul. This was no longer just an experiment. It was her life. It was their life. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll stay with you, Evan, no matter what happens." Relief flooded his features, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he were afraid she might disappear at any moment. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the sound grounding her in this impossible reality. For the first time since she had arrived on Earth, Alira wasn't thinking about her mission, or the potential consequences of her choices. She wasn't thinking about what her people might do if they found out about her pregnancy. All she could think about was the man holding her, the child growing inside her, and the future they would face together. A future that no longer belonged to just one world. The soft, insistent blinking of Alira's communicator filled the kitchen with a cold, unnatural light. Its rhythmic pulse seemed to echo the dread that had settled in the pit of Evan's stomach. He could sense the tension radiating from Alira as she stared at the device on the table, her face pale, her breath uneven. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken reality hung between them like a storm cloud waiting to break. "They know," Alira whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Who knows?" "The council," she said, her gaze never leaving the blinking light. "They've detected the pregnancy. They've been watching me ever since I failed to return from my mission. They know everything." Evan's mind spun as he tried to process the weight of those words. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder of just how fragile this moment was. He had known this was a possibility. Alira had warned him, but now that it was real, the threat felt overwhelming, far beyond anything he could have imagined. He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her arm. "What does that mean, Alira? What will they do?" She turned to face him, her eyes wide, filled with fear he had never seen in her before. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "They'll come for me, for us. The council doesn't tolerate contamination of their agents. They'll terminate the pregnancy, erase all evidence, and if I resist..." Her voice broke and she didn't have to finish the sentence. The horror of what awaited them was enough. Evan's chest tightened as a mixture of rage and fear surged through him. "No," he said, his voice low, filled with a steely resolve he barely recognized in himself. "We're not going to let that happen. They have technology far beyond anything on Earth," Alira whispered. "They can track me, find me wherever I go. Hiding won't work, Evan. It's impossible to escape them." Evan's mind raced, searching for any solution, anything that could buy them time. He tightened his grip on her arm. "We have to try. There has to be a way. We'll run. Whatever it takes. I'm not letting them take you. I'm not letting them take our child." Alira's face softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her features. "Evan, they'll come for me, and they'll do whatever it takes to erase this mistake. Even if that means..." She stopped, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "They won't," he said firmly. "I won't let them. I'll fight them myself if I have to." At that moment, the communicator's blinking stopped, replaced by a low, mechanical hum. A disembodied voice filled the room, cold and devoid of empathy. "Agent Alira of Glace 581, you have been deemed in violation of Intergalactic Protocol 47. You are ordered to report for immediate extraction and decontamination. The hybrid genetic material will be terminated to prevent further contamination. Failure to comply will result in full disciplinary action." The voice faded, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Evan's blood turned to ice. They weren't coming just for Alira. They were coming for their child, the life growing inside her. This was no longer about science or study. This was about survival. "Decontamination?" Evan spat the word, his face tight with anger. "They're treating this like you've been infected." "To them, I have been," Alira said quietly, her voice hollow. "They see emotional attachment as a weakness, an impurity. Our species values control and detachment above all else. They don't understand love. They never have." Evan paced the length of the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. The reality of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. Alira wasn't just some visitor from another world anymore. She was his partner, carrying his child. This was his family, and the idea of losing them was unbearable. He stopped, turning to her, his voice thick with determination. "We'll fight back. We'll hide. We'll go somewhere they can't find us." "They'll find me, Evan," Alira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They can track my biosignature across the galaxy. We're out of options." "There has to be a way," Evan pressed. "We'll go off the grid, leave the country, hide in the wilderness, something." Alira shook her head. "They'll find us no matter where we go." Desperation clawed at Evan's chest, the weight of helplessness pressing down on him. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing for solutions. "What about your ship? Can you use it to block their signals? Disappear?" Alira hesitated, the faintest glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. I could try. The ship has advanced cloaking technology, but I would need to disable the internal tracking systems. It could buy us some time." "Then we do that," Evan said, his voice firm. "We'll use your ship to hide, you'll disable the tracking, and we'll find somewhere safe to go. We can't just give up, Elira. We have to protect our child." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was also a quiet resolve forming. "You're right," she said softly. "We have to try. For our child." Evan stepped forward, pulling her into his arms. She trembled against him, the weight of their situation pressing down on both of them. For a moment, they just stood there, holding each other, the gravity of what lay ahead sinking in. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the life growing inside Elira, the impossible child that had brought their two worlds together. And they would face whatever threats came their way, whether from the stars or from the world around them. Evan pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice a quiet promise in the stillness of the room. "We'll figure this out. I'm not letting them take you. I'm not letting them take our family." Elira looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "I trust you, Evan. No matter what happens, I trust you." They pulled apart, the weight of their decision hanging between them. Outside, the world seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath for what was to come. The threats from above had already made their presence known. Now, all that remained was to see how far Evan and Elira would go to protect the love and life they had created against impossible odds. The night was still and heavy with anticipation. The small cabin, hidden deep in the forest, was dark, save for the flickering light of the fire that danced across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a constant reminder of the isolation that now shielded them from the world. From both worlds, Evan paced the length of the cabin, his heart racing, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. He could hear Elira's labored breaths from the next room, each one sending a jolt of fear and adrenaline through him. This was happening. Too fast, too soon. The pregnancy, accelerated by the hybrid nature of their child, had progressed more quickly than either of them could have predicted. They had prepared as much as they could, but nothing could have readied him for this moment. "Elira," Evan called softly from the doorway, his voice tight with concern. He hadn't seen her like this, vulnerable, in pain. She had always been so composed, so in control. But now she was on the verge of something she couldn't control at all. "Elira, I'm here," he said again, stepping into the room. She lay on the bed, her body racked with the contractions that had come harder and faster with every passing hour. Her face was pale, her skin glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, and her hands gripped the sheets with a force that frightened him. I'm okay," Elira whispered, her voice strained but steady. It's almost time." Evan knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he brushed a strand of damp hair away from her face. He had never seen her look so fragile, so human. And yet, in her eyes, there was a determination that mirrored his own. She was fighting, not just for herself, but for the life they had created together, the life that was now ready to enter the world. "You're strong," he said softly, his voice filled with as much reassurance as he could muster. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." Elira's eyes flickered to his, and despite the pain, she managed a small, breathless smile. "I've learned from you." The contraction hit her hard, and she gasped, her body tensing with the force of it. Evan grabbed her hand, holding on tight as she squeezed, her grip stronger than he expected. He had never felt so powerless, so terrified, but he knew this was a fight they would face together, just like everything else. Outside, the wind picked up, a gust rattling the windows as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the arrival of something new, something unimaginable. "Elira, you're almost there," Evan said, his voice shaking as he tried to stay calm. He had studied this moment, prepared as much as he could from medical texts and his own research, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of watching her give birth to their child. This wasn't just science anymore. This was them, their family, their future. Elira let out a low, guttural sound, her body arching as another contraction hit. Evan's heart ached to see her in so much pain, but there was no turning back now. The birth of their child was inevitable, as unstoppable as the rising tide. "I can feel it," she gasped, her eyes widening as another wave of pain crashed over her. "The baby. Evan, it's coming." Panic rose in his chest, but he forced it down. He had to be strong, for her, for their child. He moved to the foot of the bed, his breath quickening as he prepared to help bring their child into the world. "I'm right here, Elira," he said, his voice steady now, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Just keep breathing, you're almost there." Elira's breathing grew more rapid, her body shaking with the effort, but she nodded, holding on to him with a strength he had always admired. And then, in one final push, the room was filled with the sound they had been waiting for. The first cry of their child. A strange, beautiful sound, half alien, half human. Evan's heart swelled as he caught their baby in his arms, the small, fragile life that had brought them together in ways neither of them could have imagined. The child's skin shimmered faintly in the low light, a blend of soft human tones and the luminous glow of Alira's alien heritage. Tiny fingers curled against his palm, and as he looked into the baby's eyes, he saw not just a reflection of himself, but a glimpse of something greater, a bridge between worlds. "Alira," Evan whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he cradled their child in his arms. "We did it." Alira's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, her body spent but her eyes glowing with a fierce love that Evan had never seen before. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the baby's cheek. Her fingers lingered there, delicate and reverent, as if she too couldn't believe what they had created. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Our child." Evan carefully placed the baby in her arms, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had defied the odds, defied nature itself to bring this life into the world. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. No counsel, no threat from above. This child, their child, was real. A living, breathing testament to their love, to the connection that had transcended the stars. As Alira held their baby close, her eyes shimmering with tears, Evan knelt beside her, pressing his forehead gently to hers. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in the silence of the moment, the weight of everything they had fought for finally lifting. The world outside the cabin seemed distant now, as if it no longer had any power over them. For the first time since this journey began, Evan felt at peace. Their future was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't predict, but they had made it through the darkest storm. They had brought something new, something beautiful, into the world, a life that was part of both of them. The wind outside whispered softly, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. Together, they had created something more than human, more than alien. They had created something entirely new. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Evan looked at Alira, then at their child. "Welcome to the world," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to our world." Alira smiled, her eyes filled with a love that transcended galaxies. And in that quiet moment, Evan knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, bound not just by love, but by the life they had brought into existence. The birth of something new, something extraordinary, a love that would endure beyond worlds.